in view of the current crisis going on, I guess you could say, in the United States, I thought, in the world, not just the United States, I thought I would read today from Psalm 91, because that's sort of God's answer for situations like this, and got some really good things to say. So if you'd take a look, Torrin, if you'll put it up on the screen, there's Psalm 91, verse 1. We'll take a look at that, first of all. It's got some really pertinent and good things to say. Now, David, as far as we know, is the writer of this psalm. And David himself, a couple of things about him. He was not only king, but he was a warrior. And he was in dangerous situations throughout much of his life. And he understood that even though he was armed and had his weapons and his armor, whatever was normal for the time, he also knew it was important to trust God. And he writes from that perspective. And you see, this is an important thing to always keep in mind, that we do the ordinary natural things that we do. We take precautions, we do things of that nature, but we also trust God at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or. You know, you can go to the doctor and you can take medicine and it's all good, but you should believe God at the same time, trust God as well. One doesn't negate the other. So David here is writing, and before we read, let me tell you something else about David. David was a prophet. He's called a prophet by Jesus. Jesus quotes from David, and he says, David, being a prophet, said. So David was speaking not just as a man, but as a man in tune with or in touch with the Holy Spirit, and speaking of things that are not just from human perspective, not just human opinion, but of divine inspiration as well. And another unique thing that we're going to discover as we read, and I promise I will read here in a second, many times in David's Psalms, if you ever read the Psalms, you'll find that David begins the Psalm speaking as David, and he's talking to God many times, and he's expressing his trust in the Lord and so forth. And then something very interesting happens toward the end of the Psalm. The point of view changes, and then it's God speaking to David. So we get both sides of the issue. So it's very interesting. I presume that David wasn't sitting there with a pen in his hand writing these down. I presume that he was speaking, and a scribe or a person like that was taking it down. So I picture David standing up to say what he had to say, and then at a certain point, the Spirit of the Lord begins to speak through David. And that's what happens in this very psalm here. And it's a good one and pertinent for us in the day that we're living in today. Verse 1 says, He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. This says that, using this beautiful kind of spiritual, metaphorical language, the person that, he's talking about a person living under the protection of God, the Almighty. That's a term for God which references His mighty power. He's got all power, and so he's saying the person that puts his trust in the Lord, it's as though we're resting under His shadow, under His protection is what that's expressing. Notice verse 2, because this is really important. David says, I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust. You see, David had his trust in the Lord, but then he says, not only am I just going to trust in Him kind of, in the back part of my mind, sort of, or deep in my heart, he says, no, I will say of the Lord. In other words, this is what I've got to say about it. I say of the Lord, He is my refuge. He's my fortress. He's my God. In Him will I trust. You see, it's not just that he's trusting in the Lord, but he says, I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge, my fortress. In Him will I trust. Look at verse 3. Now he's speaking to the person reading, or the listener, that's us. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, from the noisome pestilence, and from the noisome pestilence. This is old-fashioned kind of King James language, 400 years ago. And in my everyday language. I don't go around saying pestilence. That's not part of my vocabulary. So I've done you a little favor, and I've looked it up in the dictionary. Would you like to know what pestilence means? If you look it up, and this comes from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it means, listen, now you'll be surprised when I tell you this. Pestilence literally means a contagious or epidemic disease. Now, how about that? Isn't that interesting? It's almost as though, well, you see, what we're living through in our modern day, it's not the first time these kind of things have happened. And David evidently lived through similar episodes. But he's saying, don't be afraid of these kinds of things. Just because such things are about and in the world, you can place your trust in the Almighty and in God, because He's bigger than any, let me read you that again, contagious or epidemic disease. Well, that sounds just like things we read about in the newspaper, or I guess nobody reads the newspaper anymore, on your phone. I don't know. I guess you'd get a newspaper if you had to have one. But
I write for the newspaper, Matt.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Well, I take all that back.
We all read it.
We all read the newspaper. I'm just trying to sound trendy and hip, Yes, as we know from reading the newspaper, we'll edit that out. I'll go and cut that part out. All right, never mind. Yes, this is as up to date as our newspaper. We'll put that. We'll start right there. What were we talking about? Yes, contagious and epidemic diseases. Okay. Anyway, the point is that He is bigger than any of those things. It says, He shall, listen to this, speaking of God, verse 4, He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Now, that's not to say that literally God has wings and feathers, but that's using metaphoric or symbolic or spiritual language to say that just like a kind of a mother bird would protect her young with her wings and her feathers, picture God that way. He's protecting you. He's overshadowing you and placing His protection over you. That's a good image to get. Here we are down here in this world dealing with what we've got to deal with, but we're not alone. He's placing His protection over us. That's what David is saying. He's writing to the person that, like him, places his trust in the Lord. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. Verse 6, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness. There's that same word again. He says, you shall not be afraid. Why? Because we are abiding under the shadow of the Almighty, he said. We are placing our trust in the Lord, and He's placed His protection over us because of that. And he says, you don't need to be afraid. For the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come near thee. You see, what he's saying is, you don't need to be concerned, concerned is not the right word. You don't need to be afraid because of other things that are happening elsewhere. You don't have any really control over what other people think or what other people do, but you can say for yourself, I will place my trust in the Lord. I dropped my glasses. And he says, so you don't need to be concerned or disturbed because of things that are happening elsewhere. For a soldier like David, who was in a lot of battles, that would be a real concern. There's all kinds of things going on all sides, and you could easily get distracted by people who are falling or all the destruction that's taking place. But David's attitude was, I'm not distracted by what else is going on around me. My focus is on God. My trust is in Him. And he's recommending that attitude to us. Verse 8, only with thine eyes shalt thou behold the reward of the wicked. Verse 9, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High thy habitation. See, he's saying that, like David, he's saying, you, the reader, you, the listener, you have also made the Lord your refuge and your habitation. That's the place where you place your trust. He's using this kind of metaphorical language to express that. Verse 10, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. Nigh means near. You know, back in verse 2, I called your attention to the fact that he said, I will say of the Lord. You know, his attitude is, the things that he's expressing, it's okay for you to take this for yourself. You see, he's recommending this attitude to you. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. Your dwelling is where you live. What he's saying is, it's all right for you to have this attitude. You know, you, because your trust is in the Lord, you should also adopt this attitude. No plague comes near my dwelling. You know, your dwelling is where you live with your family. You see, I don't have anything to say about what goes on outside of myself and my household. So I do have something I can say about that. And what I say is, no plague comes near my dwelling. You can say the same thing. In fact, I'll extend it a little further. Say, no plague comes near anybody who's listening to my voice right now. Because you're all sitting in my house right now, so to speak. And I'll say that only to the extent that I can, I'll extend that kind of faith over you as well. But let's all just agree about that and say, no plague comes near my dwelling. Now, see, this is not to say that we don't take ordinary precautions and do the things in the physical world, but spiritually speaking, we're saying we place our trust in God. Does that make sense? Yeah. We're looking to a higher point of protection than just physical things. I like that, by the way. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. That's a thought that you should kind of imagine. He gives his angels charge over you. Imagine a big 10-foot tall angel walking around with you, keeping an eye on you. That'll give you a little bit of confidence. You know, I say that kind of in a kind of lighthearted way, but I actually think there's some truth to that. I think the angels are real, and I don't know if they're 10 foot tall or not, but I imagine they're bigger than bigger than me. But I like to think about that. God's giving his agents, these angels, charge. That's what it says right here. He shall give his angels charge over thee, and they shall keep thee in all thy ways. Verse 12, they shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. Verse 13, thou shalt tread upon the lion and the adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet. This is metaphorical, symbolic, spiritual language. Speaking of the enemy and saying you have authority over him, you don't need to be afraid of him. You walk over the top of him. Now David has up until now been speaking for himself and speaking as David and talking about his trust in the Lord, talking about his attitude towards the Lord, his attitude of faith and confidence toward the Lord. Suddenly now in verse 14, as we read, you'll see that the point of view has now shifted. Now it's the Lord speaking to the person who has placed his trust in the Lord. Verse 14, listen to this. You could say, if you place your trust in God, here from verse 14 till the end, it's God talking now to you and to David, but to you as well, because you are trusting in him just like David did. Verse 14, because he has set his love upon me, therefore will I deliver him. I will set him on high, because he has known my name. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble, and I will deliver him and honor him. You know, I'd like it if he said he'll never have any trouble, but he didn't say he won't have any trouble. He said, I will be with him in trouble. You see, no matter what we deal with, no matter what we confront, no matter what we go through, he's with us. That's what he's saying here. I will be with him in trouble, and I will deliver him. He's with us in trouble, not as a disinterested observer, but there to help and to deliver and honor him. Verse 16, listen to this. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. Well, it says, with long life I will satisfy him. This is God talking. You should take this personally to you. Well, you might say, well, how long is long life? Well, I take it from this until you're satisfied. So don't get in a hurry. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. So don't be in a hurry. Long life, there's no real definition to that. Yeah, I take it that long means until you're satisfied. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. Now, all this comes under the heading of what he said in verse 2. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge. He is my fortress. You see, what David is getting at here is all of these truths that he's expressed about God's care for you, about his protection over you, that it's appropriate and it's right and it's correct and it's your privilege to, just like David, you also can say of the Lord, he's my protection, he's my refuge. It's an expression of your confidence in him. Now, another person that knew about trouble, like David, was the Apostle Paul. I don't know if you've ever read about the Apostle Paul's life, but he faced all kinds of difficulties. He spent time in prison because of his preaching, and he was shipwrecked, I think he says 3 times. I've never been shipwrecked once, and I hope to never be shipwrecked. But, you know, he was stoned. And people threw rocks at him is what I mean. I got to specify that. And left for dead, just so we're clear on this. But let me let me look at something Paul had to say. I want you to notice that Paul expresses the same attitude, and we can learn something from what he says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Tord, if you'd get that for me. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And I'm just going to hit a few high points here, but I want you to see a little point that he makes. And he draws on David in the Psalms as well. This is Paul writing to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And I'm going to start with verse 6. This is really good here. There's really no good place to start because it's all really good. But I'm going to start because I can't find a better place, verse 6. For God, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Verse 7 says, but we have this treasure in earthen vessels. By that he means your physical body, your physical self. In other words, you have a treasure or something of God. He shined in our hearts to give the knowledge of the light and all that he said a moment ago of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have what we have of God in physical bodies. In other words, we're in this physical world in earthen vessels. It says that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. Now, notice what he says immediately in verse 8. This is him talking about his own life. He says, we are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. You notice he's saying, we're dealing with all kinds of problems here. That's basically what he's saying. But we are not discouraged. We don't give up. We're not in despair. We're not downcast about it. Well, why is that? Well, I'm going to skip a little bit just to save time and to where he gets to the point here. Verse 13, look at what he says. Verse 13, he says, but we, having the same spirit of faith, according as it is written, and if you wonder what he means by the same spirit of faith, he's getting ready to tell you. According as it is written, and now he's quoting from David in the Psalms. According as it is written, I believed, therefore have I spoken. We also believe, and therefore speak. In other words, what I'm saying, Paul is here writing, is that what we believe, we speak according to what we believe, not according to what we're afraid of, not according to what is going on around us that's a problem. We speak according to what we believe. And he says he's basing this attitude on something that is written by David. And what he's quoting from is Psalm number 116. So this takes us back to the Psalms again, and let's just see what Paul is referring to, because I think we can learn something from that and adopt the same attitude that he had. Now, Paul is quoting from Psalm 116, and I'm going to start at the beginning of the Psalm so you get the context, because I think Paul assumes that his readers know what Psalm he's talking about. So just so we know what he's referring to, let's start in Psalm 116 with verse 1. Verse 1 says, I love the Lord because he hath heard my voice in my supplications, because he hath inclined his ear unto me. Therefore will I call upon him as long as I live. The sorrows of death compassed me. The pains of hell got hold upon me. I found trouble and sorrow. Now, when David says this in verse 3, we don't know for sure what he's talking about. We don't know exactly what he's referring to there. And when he says, the sorrows of death compassed me, the pains of hell got hold upon me, I found trouble and sorrow, it sounds like he was in a difficult situation. We don't know specifically what he's talking about, but he was in a difficult place. He was having some trouble, in a dangerous situation, you might say. Verse 4, then I called upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I beseech thee, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord, and righteous. Yea, our God is merciful. The Lord preserveth the simple. I was brought low, and he helped me. Return unto thy rest, O my soul. You know what that's saying? Your soul is on the inside. He's saying, settle down, calm down, my troubled mind. In other words, he's speaking to himself, counteracting his own sense of fear and anxiety. He says, return to thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. He's saying, let me just recenter my thinking for a moment. Instead of worrying about all the trouble and the problems and the anxiety-inducing fear that's around me, let me just refocus my attention on the Lord here. Return to thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. For thou hast delivered my soul from death, and mine eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. You see, he's got a whole different kind of tone to what he's saying. You know, earlier he was talking about all the trouble he was having, but now he's saying, you know what, he delivers me from all those things. He's delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from falling. And then he becomes very bold in verse 9. Again, we don't know what kind of trouble he was facing here. But in verse 9, it must have been life-threatening, because in verse 9 he says, I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Now, how can he say that, by the way? How can he say what's going to happen? This is his confidence talk. This is his faith speaking. He's saying, because I'm trusting in the Lord, I have confidence that whatever it was that he was going through here, this is not going to bring me down. I will, what does he say here? Let me read it again. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Now, just so you know for sure that what I just said is true, look at verse 10. This is what Paul is referring to in his own trouble. Verse 10, he says, I believed, and therefore have I spoken. You see, that's what Paul was referring to when he said, we having the same spirit of faith, we also believe, and we also speak. In other words, he says, what I believe, that's what I'm going to say. Now, here's the point of all this. You can't help the fact that anxieties and fears and pressures and cares come to your mind. But you can replace those things. You can replace the anxiety and the fear and the apprehension and the uncertainty that attacks your mind. You can come against it and replace it with your confidence and your faith in God. And you have the right, just like David said, twice now we've seen that, and just like Paul said, you have every right to say of the Lord the same thing that they said of the Lord. You have every right to say and express your faith to your. It's for your benefit. I'm not talking about going out and telling some stranger on the street. I'm talking about for your own benefit. You don't have to say it to anybody in particular. It's to you. It's for you. It's the way you counteract any kind of anxiety or fear or worry that comes into your mind. You have to yourself come against those things. Nobody else can do it for you. And you do it by the same way David did it and the same way Paul did it. He said, I will say of the Lord. Or here's what he said here, I believe and therefore have I spoken. And what he actually, specifically is saying that he believed here is in verse 9. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. He's saying the things that I believe, the things that I am placing my confidence in God about, this is where I'm going to focus my attention. And I just believe that what God says is true. And if he says he can protect me, he can protect me. And if he says he shields me with his almighty power, then he shields me with his almighty power. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to agree with what God says about me. You know, there's another interesting thing. You might not have ever noticed this, that Jesus himself said. This is in Mark's Gospel in chapter 11. But I think it's an interesting thing to observe. This is in Mark's Gospel in chapter 11, and I'm going to start with verse 12. Mark's Gospel, chapter 11, starting with verse 12. On the morrow, when they were come from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple, and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. Verse 17, And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves? And verse 18, And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and they sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. And all that took place, we see that's what happened while he went into Jerusalem. And then, verse 19 says, When the evening was come, the even means the evening, he went out of the city. Now you remember what just happened on the way into the city. Verse 20. And in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree. Remember that? He said to it earlier. He went to find something to eat, and there was nothing. And he said, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. Now they've come back to the fig tree, and they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. Now this is a very remarkable thing here. I'm sure it says that they all took note of it. And verse 21, Peter calling to remembrance saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursed is withered away. Now look at what Jesus says in response to this. Verse 22, Jesus answering saith unto them, Have faith in God. Now, that little statement right there, that's the theme that David was expressing in the 91st Psalm, where he's expressing his trust and his reliance upon God. This is the same attitude that Paul was expressing when he said, We're troubled on every side, but not distressed, and all those things. He said, We're looking for God's protection. He's expressing his faith or his confidence in God. And Jesus says the same thing, but look at the context he puts it in, verse 23. For verily, I say unto you that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that the things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. It's interesting that both David and Paul, and now here Jesus is saying, the things that you believe, it's all right to say those things. It's all right to align yourself and say what your heart believes. In other words, you can choose to believe and trust in God, and it's all right just to say, you know what, I place my trust in God. How could David have known, I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living? He has no way of knowing that, but what he's saying is, this is what I believe. Because my trust is in God, I believe it's going to be this way. I believe things are going to be okay. Now, what kinds of things can you say of the Lord? Well, here, let's just use for an example. I'm going to turn to Romans chapter 8. Anything that you find written in this Bible is okay for you to take hold of. It's for you. It's for your benefit. But I love this last part of Romans chapter 8, and I just want to bring it to your attention because it's sort of all-inclusive. It sort of covers everything. Romans chapter 8, verse 31 says this. Romans 8:31. What shall we then say to these things? Now, by the way, this is chapter 8. When he says, what shall we say to these things? He's referring to everything he said from chapter 1 up to chapter 8. And he spent 8 chapters talking about the gospel. 8 chapters talking about not things that you're supposed to do, but things that God has already done. 8 chapters talking about how God has arranged a perfect salvation for us, has taken care of everything that we might possibly need, removed our guilt, removed anything that would ever disqualify us, and because of our faith in Jesus has brought us into a perfect right standing with Him. 8 chapters describing all of that. So he says, what shall we say to these things? In other words, how can we sum it all up? Listen to this. If God be for us, who can be against us? That's what we can say about it. Now that's a rhetorical question. He doesn't mean that there's any doubt about it. He could have just as easily said, because God is for us, who can be against us? Or I like what another translation says, and I'm sorry I don't have this on the screen to put it up here, but another translation I saw says this: because God is for us, nothing can be successful against us. Because God is for us, nothing can be successful against us. You see, it's okay for you to believe that too. Paul's writing this to encourage you to adopt that same attitude. If God be for us, what can be successful against us? Who can be against us? Verse 32. He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? You know what that means? He's saying, if he sent Jesus to the cross to take away your sins, how is it that he's not going to take care of everything else that's less than that? In other words, if he did the one big thing, he'll take care of all the lesser things too. That's what he's saying. Do you know why he's writing this, by the way? I'll just tell you. He's trying to inspire confidence in the heart of all of us as readers, the same confidence that he himself has. Verse 33. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. In other words, you can't even bring charges against you because God has already made you right. Verse 34. Who is he that condemneth? It's Christ that died, yea, rather is risen again, who's even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. He's saying, don't think that God's ever going to condemn you about anything, because he's already sent Jesus, and he's risen from the dead, and he's at the right hand of God on your behalf, making intercession for you. Verse 35. I like this one. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? That's a good question, isn't it? What can come between you and Christ's love for you? Shall tribulation, that word means trouble, it means pressure literally, or distress, persecution, or famine, or nakedness, peril, or a sword. Paul experienced all those things. And what he's saying here is, I've learned that nothing can get between you and God's love for you. Verse 36, as it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long, we are accounted sheep for the slaughter. The reason he quotes this is, he's saying, you might get this attitude. You might mistakenly think that this is how it is. And we know that he doesn't mean that it is how it is. He quotes this to say, you might be thinking this, but it's not true. Because in the very next verse, verse 37, he said, nay. You know what nay means? It means no. Not neigh like the horse. No. Nay meaning no. In other words, no, he hasn't left us like sheep for the slaughter. No, he hasn't left us alone to deal with things. No, he says, in all these things, all those troublesome things he just talked about, in all these things we are more than conquerors. Not because you're strong, not because you conquered anything, but through him that loved us. You know, conqueror is one thing, but when he says more than conqueror, he means even above the person who conquers. It's a, you don't really get it from the English translation, but if you look in the Greek language, this more than conquerors, that little expression, it's one word. It's a compound word in the Greek language. And again, it's not because I'm so smart. Anybody can look this up. I'm just telling you what I found when I looked it up. More than conquerors, the word for conqueror is a word that you might have heard of before. In the Greek language, it's Nike. Now, if you buy the tennis shoes called Nike, you might say it that way. It means, the reason why they call those tennis shoes Nike, the word Nike means victory. It literally means victory. And the Greek word that's translated more than conquerors has Nike as its core, but it has a modifying prefix, huper, H-U-P-E-R, which means the same thing our word hyper means. Hyper, you know what that means when we put that before. It means above and beyond, doesn't it? So what it means is above and beyond victory is what it means, literally. A super overcomer or super victorious or above and beyond victory. You know, I heard one person say it's like this. And, you know, he says it's because, not because we gained it, it's because of him that loved us. More than conquerors, above and beyond conquerors, because he did it for us, in other words. I heard one person explain it this way, that the heavyweight champion of the world, he gets into the ring and he fights and he overcomes and he conquers and he's victorious. But then he gets the paycheck and he takes it home and gives it to his wife, and she's more than a conqueror because she didn't have to fight. She got the benefit, but she didn't have to get in the ring and fight. We see Jesus got in the ring, so to speak, and fought and overcame the world and everything in the world. That's what he told his disciples. He said, I've spoken these things unto you that in me you might have peace. In the world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer. He said, I've overcome the world. Our faith is in somebody who's bigger than anything in the world. And Paul here says, in all these things. To me, when I see an expression like all these things, that makes me think all is an all-inclusive word, isn't it? Doesn't all just about include anything? In all these things, we could say it this way, we come out on top. Why? Because we're so great? Because we're so strong? No, because of him that loved us. Now, implied in this is also the response to that. We put our trust in him that loved us. We're not indifferent to him. We're placing all of our confidence in him that loved us. Verse 38, for I am persuaded, Paul says, I am persuaded that neither death nor life, angels nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Paul is writing saying, I'm persuaded that nothing you face in this life can get between you and God's love for you. He's writing so that you will also be persuaded like he is. You see, he came to that sense of ultimate, absolute confidence in God, to where he said, I'm confident, I'm not afraid of anything, there's nothing that worries me. You see, he's been through shipwrecks and persecution and famine and everything you want to name, and he said, I found out that none of those things are bigger than God. He's bigger than any of those things. And I'm persuaded that I can place my trust in him and he can deal with anything. He wants us to be just that persuaded. Now, I'd like to read this to you from the Message translation. I think it's really good in conclusion. And if you can go back, turn to verse 31, let's just read this from the Message. I think I love what the Message has to say. So what do you think? With God on our side like this, how can we lose? How about that for an attitude? You see, this ultimately is the bottom line for us. God's on your side. Now, I've talked to a lot of people, in various contexts, and what I hear from people sometimes is, when I talk along these lines, is, yeah, but I'm not worthy for God to be for me. Because of what? You don't know all the mistakes I've made. You don't know all what I've done. Well, you know what? On the other hand, you don't know all what I've done either. We don't, and none of those things are relevant. Because Jesus knew what we'd all do 2,000 years ago when he went to the cross and he took all those things off the table. That's what it means. He carried in his own body our sins, which includes anything that would ever count as a disqualification. So he's on our side. He sent Jesus to do that because he is on our side. So he says, what do you think? With God on our side like this, how can we lose? That's the attitude that you should have. Now, again, in the current context, that's not to say that you should be reckless or, not do, the precautionary things that all the experts say to do. But you should be resting in the fact that, you know what, God's on my side. And ultimately, I don't have anything to be afraid of because he's on my side. And you can be just as bold as what we said David and Paul did. You can be just that bold and say, I can say of the Lord, he's on my side. And I won't lose. No plague comes near my dwelling. You can say all those things we read today, and it's all true about you too. Okay, let's get the next verse. If God didn't hesitate to put everything on the line for us, embracing our condition and exposing himself to the worst by sending his own son, is there anything else he wouldn't gladly and freely do for us? How about that for a thought? In other words, if he sent Jesus to the cross, he'll take care of all the other things too. we can count on him to do that. Okay, let's get the next verse. And who would dare tangle with God by messing with one of God's chosen? That's a good thought. Let's get the next one. Who would dare even to point a finger? The one who died for us, who was raised to life for us, is in the presence of God at this very moment, sticking up for us. That's Jesus, by the way. He says he's in the presence of God right now, sticking up for us. You think Jesus doesn't know what's going on in our situation, in our life? He's in the presence of God, it says right now, sticking up for us, keeping an eye on our situation. Let's get the next verse. Do you think anyone is going to be able to drive a wedge between us and Christ's love for us? There's no way. Not trouble, not hard times, not hatred, not hunger, not homelessness, not bullying threats, not backstabbing, even the worst sins listed in Scripture. Okay? Go ahead, Torn. They kill us in cold blood because they hate you. We're sitting ducks. They pick us off one by one. Let's get the next one. None of this phases us because Jesus loves us. That's a good attitude to have. None of the things that you hear about that might otherwise inspire fear needs to faze you or disturb you because you have your confidence in Jesus who loves you. Okay, let's get the next verse. Is there another one? I'm absolutely convinced that nothing living or dead, angelic or demonic, today or tomorrow, okay? High or low, thinkable or unthinkable, absolutely nothing can get between us and God's love because of the way that Jesus, our Messiah, our Master, has embraced us. Well, isn't that a good thought? Paul writes all of this, again, to inspire confidence in you, to inspire a sense of faith, of confidence, of certainty, of, as David said, return to your rest, O my soul, to give you a sense of rest and peace and knowing that God can take care of everything that confronts us and deals with has to do with us. And our job, our part in this, is the same thing from start to finish. It's faith, it's confidence, it's trust, and that's what we do, and He does the rest. Okay, let's all stand up today.